Ситуацію в Очеретиному Донецької області.
Наразі я вам скажу найсвіжішу інформацію. Так, дійсно, ворогу вдалося прорватися і закріпитися в певній частині цього населеного пункту. Наразі частина, в якій знаходиться противник, перебуває під нашим вогневим контролем. Вживаються всі заходи, щоб вибити ворога звідти, тривають бої важкі, ситуація контролюється підрозділами сил оборони. Слід також наголосити, що для того, щоб розвинути цей тактичний успіх в районі Очеретиного, для подальшого прориву нашої оборони, ворог задіяв на цьому напрямку 4 бригади Збройних сил Російської Федерації. З нашого ж боку вживаються всі заходи для стабілізації обстановки на Авдіївському напрямку та повернення контролю над Очеретиним. З цією метою також введено додаткові сили та засоби з резерву.
We are now almost a week since the fanfare of the US $60 billion aid package to Ukraine, which, when I analyzed it, I determined was purely for propaganda purposes and would have zero impact on the battlefield situation. And this was because I think the US has finally accepted the reality and ridded themselves of the hubris that has characterized all of their military analysis of their enemies, of Russia, China, and Iran. They no longer preach the folly of Russian incompetence, nor are they relying on the underestimations of the Iranian army after the recent missile attack, which, it is now confirmed, actually hit 3 Israeli targets: the Nevatim Air Base, the Ramon Air Base, and a 3rd radar facility in the Golan Heights.
1. The Nevatim Air Base in the Negev Desert in southern Israel. 2nd, the Ramov Air Base. And 3rd, the Unit 8200 Intelligence Collection Facility jointly operated by Israel and the CIA in the Golan Heights, or the Golan Heights as the Iraqis pronounce it. These were the 3 main targets, military targets, that Iran had selected for its counterattack. It is noteworthy that Iran did not try and hit any civilian population / infrastructure targets which may have had a greater impact on television screens, but could have been very, very counterproductive in the level of reaction it would have drawn. These 2 air bases, Nevatim and Ramon, the Nevatim air base specifically was the base from which the Israeli F-35 aircraft had taken off and gone to hit the Iranian consulate in Damascus in Syria.
And as far as I understand it, these were the 3 most heavily guarded facilities in the entire planet.
The fact of the matter is that these 3 targets of the Iranian missile counterstrike, that Nevatim Air Base, Ramon Air Base, and the Golan Intelligence Collection Facility were 3 of the most heavily defended places on planet Earth.
So I think at last the Western officials have accepted that 1, they are in an attrition war. 2, that the enemies are far more sophisticated and competent than they initially calculated, and perhaps even further, more than they are. And 3, that they are currently losing. So this brings me to Ukraine. My take on the current strategy is that the US is on to Russia's game plan, which is to bleed America dry economically in an unwinnable war. In fact, I will go further. It is my opinion that President Putin is hoping and actually wishing that the US will be so stupid enough to continue to send more and more financial aid to Ukraine, so that it will only deepen America's economic crisis and hasten their eventual decline. Because realistically, this war is long past the stage where any favorable result can be achieved for Ukraine. And everyone knows it. So sending more money at this stage will be totally wasteful. So my theory is that the US is cognizant of this fact and has developed a clever strategy that they were able to get Congress to approve of. See, the dilemma is that the US wants Ukraine to hold off the Russian army at least until the elections are over. And as Sir Richard Barron said recently, Ukraine is at a risk of collapsing psychologically, as in they may lose the will to fight. That's how I remember him putting it in this article right here. So the US has devised an aid package that in terms of its effect benefits only the US, but announced it in such a way that makes the world, and more importantly, makes the Ukrainians believe that weapons are truly coming. Thus, the Congress is appeased as they can rest assured the money will not be wasted in Ukraine, while Ukrainians get the much needed morale boost of hope, as false as it may be. Because how I assessed it in my last video is that only 14 billion out of the 61 billion that was promised is directed to helping the Ukrainian army on the front lines. And even of that 14 billion, it is not sent directly to Ukraine, but to the US defense contractors under the Security Initiative to either build or find weapons to then fly over to Ukraine. So here's the play. The US knows it's over for Ukraine, and any money sent there in circumstances where the country is facing defeat will more likely be stolen by the many corrupt politicians or officials or destroyed on the front line in the hands of a poorly trained and outgunned Ukrainian army. In essence, Congress just approved the package to replenish US stockpiles, created jobs, and is disguised as if it's really being sent to Ukraine. But now, almost a week later, we finally get to assess how successful this morale boost package really was. And I was away all of last week on business in the UK, and now that I have returned, I have awoken to a map that looks vastly different from the one I saw just before I left my home country. And in the process of getting myself up to speed, it seems to me that this aid package has not had the uplift on the morale it was expected to have. What I am hearing is that another defensive line collapsed around the small town called Ocheretyne in the Donetsk Oblast, a few miles west of Avdiivka. So that's what I'm going to talk about today. And with that, let's get into it. So on the 17th of April, it was reported in the French newspaper Le Figaro that after the fall of Avdiivka, the Russian forces began approaching the locality of Ocheretyne, which was around the same time that on another axis, Russian forces had entered the first homes in Chasiv Yar, west of Bakhmut. Krasnohorivka was also penetrated by the Russians around that time. But overall, since the beginning of the year, the Russian gains did not exceed a few dozen square kilometers per week. But don't be mistaken, this is not a sign of any weakening in the Russian offensive. Le Figaro reports that this is a strategy of shaping the battlefield, which is an Anglo-Saxon military term, and it means gradually destroying the opposing fortifications before launching limited attacks. So this town of Ocheretyne is about 15 kilometers west of Avdiivka, and it's not just a simple village like the others that Russia has captured. It is an important logistical center which is crossed by a railway line that leads to Pokrovsk. Given its importance, the Ukrainians had sent their most elite brigade. Remember that 47th Mechanized Brigade, which fought both in the failed Ukrainian summer counteroffensive towards Zaporizhia, and then again in Avdiivka just before its collapse. Now it's positioned in Ocheretyne. But this brigade had been badly battered by those two defeats and had not had a break in fighting for nearly a year. To add salt to that wound, the brigade was running low on their best M2 Bradley infantry fighting vehicles and the American M1 Abrams tanks. So apparently the story goes like this. There was a planned rotation for the 47th Brigade to be pulled off the front line east of the village of Ocheretyne. And somehow the Russians got wind of this plan and decided to focus their attack in that area while the brigade was retreating. And this is where the story apparently gets interesting. The Ukrainian Army's 115th Brigade was supposed to take the place of the retreating 47th Mechanized Brigade along the front. But as Forbes puts it, something clearly went wrong. So a report came from Mykola Melnik. He is the commander or the company commander of the 47th Brigade, and he lost a leg during the summer counteroffensive. And his report on the situation, though it is lacking in detail, it is as clear as it is succinct. It was summed up in this one sentence: certain units just So to elaborate, Russian scouts and drone operators who were surveilling the positions held by this elite 47th Brigade, they expected to find fresh troops from the replacement 115th Mechanized Brigade in the same trenches, but instead, when they arrived, they found no one. So this allowed the Russians to be able to travel along a railroad track from the west of Avdiivka and capture a narrow salient on the map that resembles what you see in this map right here, a 5-mile long stab into the Ukrainian line and lodged into the town of Ocheretyne. Forbes magazine reported that a Russian breakthrough there could have collapsed the Ukrainian line west of Avdiivka and forced some tens of thousands of Ukrainian troops to flee the entire Donetsk Oblast. And according to Forbes, the only reason why the Russians did not break through was because this elite 47th Brigade, which was supposed to be retreating, they decided to turn around and from their designated rotation and rejoined the battle. It was noted at that time, by the way, that the Russian Army's 90th Guards Tank Division, which was nearby, still had not yet been committed to widen the salient created in Ocheretyne. So according to reports, it was the 30th Motor Rifle Brigade of the Russian Army who was able to make the initial breakthrough into Ocheretyne, and by the 24th of April, it was reported that they had captured most of Ocheretyne, and it was described as the fastest penetration into Ukrainian territory by the Russian army in months. It was also quite ominously described as an advance that threatens to collapse Ukraine's defensive line west of Avdiivka. So no doubt a sense of panic is now gripping the Ukrainian army. Deep State UA described it as a Pandora's box. Further, the Ukrainians were so desperate that they rushed the 100th Mechanized Brigade, which is one of the newest and most lightly equipped brigades in the entire Ukrainian army and totally unsuited for this kind of frontline combat. The mere fact that the Ukrainians had to rush in a comparatively weak and green brigade into such a dire and crucial frontline situation so quickly speaks to the paucity of the Ukrainian reserves west of Avdiivka. To the contrast, on the Russian side, they have the entire tank division of the 90th Brigade surrounding Avdiivka. So at this point in the story, it was a race to see if the Russians could send in their 90th Tank Brigade reserves into the gap in Ocheretyne before the Ukrainians can find and mobilize additional reinforcements to stop the breakthrough. And a collapse like this is no doubt embarrassing for the Ukrainian army, and thus there is currently a witch hunt going on in the social media spaces for the 115th Mechanized Brigade. All the Ukrainian media is talking about it. But according to militaryland.net, they reported that while the 115th Brigade had some fault to bear, there were other brigades in the area that could have come to its aid. The 115th Mechanized Brigade apparently covered the right flank of the railway near Novokalnovo. Military Land reports that contrary to Forbes, that the information about the 115th Brigade and the allegation that they were the ones who were supposed to replace the 47th Mechanized Brigade is actually false, as the 115th Brigade actually replaced the 23rd Mechanized Brigade near Novokalnovo. In fact, it was the 104th Territorial Defense Brigade who was supposed to be covering Ocheretyne itself, according to Military Land. But I suppose all this is just an academic exercise now, because the point is, Military Land defends the 115th Brigade, who lost more than 20 soldiers in the last few days, and apparently they continue to remain on the right flank of Ocheretyne in a defensive position. So by this past Friday, however, the situation significantly worsened for the Ukrainian army. The Russians had deployed more reserves and brigades, particularly the 15th and 74th Motor Rifle, the 25th Air Assault and the 3rd Assault Brigade, along with the 425th Assault Battalion, into the salient and was widening it. An estimate is that the Russians have more than 10,000 troops in or near the salient in Ocheretyne, while just 3,000 Ukrainians oppose them. That's just over a 3-to-1 advantage for the Russians. Forbes magazine described the situation as desperate for the exhausted Ukrainian brigades and said that it was a foregone conclusion that the Ukrainians would lose a few villages around the Ocheretyne axis. But the real risk, however, is if the Ukrainian command responsible for forces west of Avdiivka will have no choice but to cut their losses and retreat a few miles to the west of Avdiivka and create a new secondary defensive line southwest of Ocheretyne. This could amount to the surrender of tens of square miles of territory. And the real risk is that if the retreat, which is considered one of the most difficult maneuvers to conduct during a war, if the retreat is poorly executed, it can result in a second or third breakthrough and cause a chain reaction and a wider collapse of the Ukrainian defense lines in the entire Donetsk Oblast. But it just seems like it's only a matter of time before this retreat may have to occur. According to the Ukrainian Center for Defensive Strategies, they reported that Russia has an advantage in the air and artillery, delivering continuous strikes on the Ukrainian positions west of Avdiivka. But the point to me is that the morale boost package, as I call it, seems to have utterly failed to achieve that objective. While the reports on exactly who is to blame for this sudden collapse of a very important defense line, one thing is clear to me. Some of the units who were supposed to hold the line simply did not. As Forbes magazine reported on the 23rd of April, whatever went wrong with the 115th Brigade appears to be somewhat systemic in the Ukrainian army, because it's the second Ukrainian unit to collapse on the Eastern Front in just the last few weeks. The first unit was the 67th Mechanized Brigade, which was defending Ukraine's most vulnerable city, Chasiv Yar, until some internal squabbling within the brigade's command staff, many of whom are far-right political groups. That internal conflict compelled the Defense Ministry in Kiev to, and I'll quote this, liquidate the brigade. Now in total, overall, it is estimated that the Ukrainian army has about 100 combat brigades left, most of whom are described as being exhausted from non-stop fighting without any rotation. So we can expect these kind of collapses to occur more frequently as this war enters the end game. Our brigade is normally comprised of around 4,000 men, but many of the Ukrainian brigades have half that number. So we can estimate that the Ukrainian army comprises somewhere around 200,000 men, give or take a few. The Russian army is nearing 700,000, hence the 3-to-1 advantage that the Russians have in Donetsk, given the figures earlier of 10,000 Russians against 3,000 Ukrainians. The game is over, folks. No amount of Western equipment can save these statistics. The Russians know it, the Ukrainians are well aware of it, and now it seems the Americans know it as well. So if you ask me, that $14 billion, which is supposed to go to US defense contractors to build or procure weapons for Ukraine, will not ever be sent to Ukraine in these dire circumstances. And it's because the Americans are not stupid. They know these facts and statistics I've just told you about. They know what awaits Ukraine in this summer, given the upcoming Russian offensive. Collapse and defeat.